Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Silver Tempest, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over my top tier tweaks as we look towards the San Diego Regional Championships, and I'm also looking very closely at this meta still, because there's still a regional in Liverpool in a couple weeks' time, which of course will be knee-jerking from the San Diego results a little bit, but I'm still trying to keep up to date with deck lists. I'm going to be going over some of the top decks in the game and where my head's at with the lists, and then we'll be having a quick look at Trainer Hill as well and talking matchups and how we can try and make things a little bit closer, and also maybe indicative of why I'm teching the way I am with some of my deck lists. So we're going to have a lot of discussion on a lot of lists today. Let's start off with the top dog, the Aurora-based Lugia. Nothing too crazy going on in my deck list. I think the Pokemon lineup is more or less the same as Connor Finton's lineup, the only key difference being I'm playing Manaphy instead of Amazing Rare Raikou. Now, it's a bit of a strange one, because I do like the pressure that Raikou can put on, especially against Lost Box. I think that's where it's probably most critical. But I'm choosing to drop it just for Manaphy for a more defensive approach here. And it's actually because of a couple other tech cards that you'll see in the list, where I'm playing double Tool Jammer. Now, Tool Jammer I think is a really underutilized card in Lugia. I think it has a lot of merit. It can prevent Raikou and Regieleki being very dangerous even without having a Dunsparce in your deck list, which is really nice. It also can hurt Mew players and even Radiant Charizard in that late game, giving you a lot of avenues to use your Lugia V-Star in the mirror and in the late game stages against all sorts of decks. Rather than having to go pure to one prize, you can actually have a tanking option. With Jammer V-Guard in the list, you can actually survive hits against a Mew, which I think has a ton of merit now that they are very hand disrupty. Rather than you having to constantly reassemble one prize attackers, having a Lugia that sits on the board is actually tremendous value for you. So I've kind of gone back in a time capsule by having the Jammers in, and of course taking out the Lost Vacuum, because you have Jammer now that can go on your Yveltal if you need it to against Duraludon, but also this Jammer being a headache for Lost Box players, just in general, where we're going to be Marnie jammering to stop them getting free value from their Comphase with air balloons, which I think is really nice. So it gives you defensive plays, whilst also respecting Duraludon, which I think is really nice. You'll notice that I'm not playing Choice Belt. Now, that is a bit risky, and it actually allows other Lugia players to take advantage, but in a closed deck list, they have to have some real read on your deck list to be able to make that play, and sort of just sending a Lugia up, expecting your Zard to not just smack them back. So I think in general you don't get punished by it too much. And I know that Liam Halliburton already made a really deep run, a top 8 placement with a Lugia list that had dropped belts. I was kind of cynical of that until I started thinking about just how one prizey I'm expecting this meta to be in San Diego, and even just like the mirror turns into a one prize matchup for the most part. Oftentimes your Mew prize map doesn't involve the Charizard with a belt ever, so it doesn't actually come into play that much. So I'm hoping to steal some spaces by going towards Jammers here, and those spaces really just become a second Collapse Stadium. I think we're kind of under-respecting Reggie right now collectively. Certainly Connor's list was, and I can expect a small resurgence of Reggie going into San Diego. So I think Double Collapse makes a ton of sense. It's also a real headache for Mew again, where a lot of their counter stadiums are paths. So just having a Collapse down means that they're not capitalizing and digging through their deck as well as they'd like, because their main stadium bounce would be the path, or if they're using the vacuum to get rid of your collapsed, it's one less out for their own paths that could then stick later on. So I think the collapse stadium is a really solid include. Again, there were times early on in this format where I expected 2 collapse to be pretty staple. Everyone's stolen that space and made it 1 collapse this whole time. But I do like adding in that second copy of collapsed. The main reason I like the Manaphy, alongside the Jammer, it means your V-Stars actually tank against the Reggie players, and obviously they can't put the 40 damage hits to like finish you off or whatever, which is really important. The Manaphy also good against Raikou, which is in Rayquaza Lost Box and some mirrors if people are going to be using Connor's 60, so I do like the mana fee, and of course it's, you know, a way to prevent a Kyogre from taking a 3-prize knockout or 2 prizes in a turn with its big surge. So timing the mana fee is going to be important, but it's definitely a strong option in the list. I'm at double Fish and Birdkeeper, so a small bit of respect for control / paralysis. Not a huge amount though. I've previously had Eldegoss in here. You can flip-flop it as you like, but right now I'm pretty happy with a 60. 16 energy as well makes me fairly comfortable against controlling archetypes. Again, we could respect this even more, but this is more or less just a streamline Lugia with minimal techs of double collapsed and double jammer. I think that's best against the mainstream stuff. I'm low-key interested in cancelling Cologne. I'd definitely consider 2 copies this weekend, to be honest with you. I've not put it in my list ultimately, but it's just such a good card at beating nonsense, you know what I mean? It's really good against Weezing, really good against Aerodactyl V-Star, really good against like Miltank. If you were playing Raikou, you could bring up Manaphy, Cologne it, and take a 2-prize knockout there as well, so you'd have to do some gymnastics to make the most out of Cologne in your list, but I do think it has a ton of merit, and of course it obviously helps out against Duraludon, I should mention as well, so you're not all in on a Yveltal player, you can hit it with other stuff, so yeah, I'm low-key interested in in Cologne for things like Aerodactyl, but I'm still kind of cynical that those sorts of decks will reach more than like 10% of the meta collectively. So I don't really want to spend 2 slots on that when I could just improve the mainstream matchups, which are still like Mirror, Reggie's, Mew. And I think, and even Tooljammer's good against Lost Box for denying free value with Confe the whole time and makes your Marlies more powerful. So those are the things that I'm mostly debating. That's where I'm at with my current Lugia. Let's talk about the Mew builds. So let's start with Judge Mew. Again, more or less just pretty straightforward and standard. We're at the high Judge count because we like this to disrupt even Oranguru for obviously Lost Box and Lugia, both mainlining it. I'm not playing cross switchers. I've always been happier with ropes, to be perfectly honest, especially when we're committing so much space to disruption with Judge, Path, Vacuum, and Lost City. This eats up so much space that also adding in the cross switches gives you so much clog, and it just feels a little bit rough. So I'm happier playing the ropes personally. That's my own preference. It has bought me space, and it's something that I like doing, but that's up to you if you want to do anything else. I'm liking the big Parasol right now. Has a lot of utility against both Yveltals, the sort of control one and the amazing Yveltal, so I think that's worth the space. Again, it's pretty straightforward. Other than that, the Lost Cities should be respecting Reggie at least somewhat. I could easily see an Avery coming into this list as well, because you still do struggle against the Reggie players here and there. But I think especially with the ropes, the Lost City can get hidden value. Obviously, they can try and rope into one of their 3-ofs, i.e. Aleki and Gigas, but it's not always possible, especially if you've Lost City'd one earlier. You can make life awkward for them with that sort of play. So yeah, that's really what I've eyed up right now with my Path. So, yeah, my Judge Path Mew. I think it's pretty solid. This is the one I would play over a Fusion Mew, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it just has disruption at its core, and I think that's a stronger win condition against the Mirror and against Lugia than Tempo. But that's my opinion. Let's go on to my Fusion-based build of Mew. Again, I'm trying to steal a couple spaces here. I've actually worked in a couple Rotom phones because I want to have that extra push and just making sure that we get our ultimate turn 1 rolling. And I think this helps out a lot. The spaces I've stolen is I'm playing just 2 Mew VMAX, and I'm only playing 1 copy of Choice Belt. It's similar logic I took with Lugia, saying that I'm going to be up against Reggie's, I'm going to be up against Lost Box. In the Mirror, it's only important if I have to go for a VMAX, and even then you only need 1 copy. You don't even have the reduction hurting you too much in Mirror, basically ever, because you're hitting into Genesect, or you're using your Fusion Energy and not having your own reduction, so you don't care about Oricorio, and even then you have plus powers, right? So I feel like buying that space with the Choice Belt makes a little bit of sense to me. You even have that push potential of hitting 280 without Choice Belt or damage mods, because you could have a 4 Fusion Energy board. So just buying those 2 Rotom Phone consistency / speed slots makes me feel a lot happier about this list, and just making sure that we're getting that Echo rolling while still having the disruption of, again, Judge over Marnie, because we want to actually be effective with our disruption, and if people are guruing, then it's not going to be effective. And then also having that Silene for some reload here and there. It's another reason why I'm happy enough playing 1 Belt and 2 Mew, because you have the Silene Power Pad in here to reload in certain instances when need be. So yeah, that would be my fusion-based build of Mew. I really like the slots that I've stolen just to gain 2 Rotom phones. If you want those slots to be other things, that's also interesting to me. If you want it to be like an extra stadium card or something else, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. These could even be 2 catcher spaces if you're feeling very spicy. But right now I'm liking Rotom phones just to make plan A work as best as possible. So that's my Mew. I would expect in general there to be a small downtick in Drapion. Like, I've taken it out of my Lugia. It's not in all of my Lost boxes. So I think it's fairly safe to play Mew this weekend. I feel more comfortable playing Mew than Mewtwo Control, because Mewtwo will still just lose on the spot to Drapions, whereas Mew can still fight the fight, you know what I mean? I would expect them to be in an amount of these decks still, but I would say less than 50% of the decks you'll be coming up against, whereas everyone pretty much had Drapion teched in last tournament. I think now it may be okay to play Mew again. Still comes with its risks, and there are still bad matchups out there, but I would expect less Drape on the whole. Let's talk about Lost Box then. I think the sort of frontrunner most popular is likely to be Raikou Ray, and it's the one that I've put a lot of time into. This is still the same 60 that I had on the channel. I really like the 60, to be honest with you. I like having 2 copies of Training Court. I think it really helps out against Regis and Mew by having an extra Stadium Bounce and making sure that your Greninja's always online and constantly digging through the deck, which I think is really important, so you don't just stall with the deck, because you need to be having combos on a number of turns, not just 1 turn or 2 turns. You need to be popping off of your Ray in back-to-back sequences sometimes, and you need to be using your Raikou effectively. I've thought about Choice Belt coming in to make that Raikou that little bit more effective, making the Rayquaza that little bit more effective as well, but I'm not really a fan of cutting anything else from the list, because I'm already at 1 Air Balloon, I'm already at 10 Energy, which is kind of the lowest it can be. I'm at 2 carts, those can't really go any lower. So I don't really know where a space comes from in the 60, to be honest with you, so don't really know where that wiggle room really lies. I guess it could possibly be a supporter, because we're a little bit higher than most with the double Raihan and the Birdkeeper alongside the boss's orders. The reason why it's boss as well, of course, is rather than Serena, is so that we can deal with Manaphy's and other things like that. Even though we do have Lost Mine available, it gives you an alternate option, but this could also be a Serena. I've played Serena in multiple other Lost boxes previously, knowing that you have Sableye for other 1 prize stuff. But this seems pretty reasonable. I am playing Echoing Horn again. This is more of like a tech inclusion so that I'm not completely folding to Ice Q. If you don't care about Ice Q so much, you can just get rid of it, obviously. Or if you don't care about Flying Peak or anything like that, you can just get rid of the Horn. The Horn also has upside, you know, you can do some Sableye sprinkling in the mirror that little bit more effectively, or you can bring back 2 prizes for Raikou to gobble up as well. So it's not just an Ice Cube card, it has utility. But I think it is more of a tech side of things. If you want to add in an extra energy, I would expect it to be either Grass or Lightning, because those are the ones both these guys use, and then it gives you some insight when you're doing blind flower selects. So yeah, I think the main thing putting me off this deck as me wanting to play it and really liking Lost Box in general would just be like, this is so much hard work and brain power going into a deck, and it feels like if you mis-select or just even misremember once you've like manied your things back into deck and not remember to check your hand before maning it all to the bottom, like what resources are still around before you use like your Mirage Gates, Rods, and like Raihans all in the right sequence, because I feel like things can go wrong for you at times, and you're going to have some hard selects that's just like inevitable throughout the day, and it can feel really bad with a slower deck like this to sort of lose midway through a game just because something went awry that wasn't really in your control. Obviously, you do play the Guru, and you do have some things that are free fodder to get rid of, and not everything's important in every matchup. So there is an element of things that, you know, can just be thrown away, but that would be the main thing putting me off Rayquaza in general. Let's have a look at the Charizard Lost Box. This is what I actually played in my previous regional, and I'm sticking with the same 60. I don't see a reason to change anything with my list. My only loss of the entire tournament was to Ice Cube Double Wash Water, and I wasn't playing Horn or Temple. If I played either of those cards, I could have a better time into that matchup. but I'm expecting Palkia in general to be like less popular. So I'm fine just jamming the same 60, honestly. I don't see a reason to change anything. The logic is still very sound. The only thing I would possibly consider would be either Ice Cube answers or a second Manaphy, because there's going to be more Raikou Ray mirrors, and just being in control of your Manaphy and establishing it over and over again is really important. You already have Clara, which maybe puts you a little bit ahead of the mirror, that has to like rod back in Manaphys or whatnot, but we actually don't take advantage of Manaphy outside just dealing with it once per turn, so bit of a weird one. We should have enough reload for Manaphy whenever we need to, but we're still feeding their Sableye. So just a small debate there, really. But I still really like this 60, to be honest. I don't think there's a problem with Laxzard. I know everyone's going to be like, oh, Greninja draws too many cards, it's way too good. But we're in a very path-heavy meta. This list is very good at not requiring Mirage Gates to be able to still hit through a Stoutland. And I think that's one of the bigger issues of like Raikou Ray, that has to get to 7 as soon as possible because there could be a Stoutland bearing down on you straight away. This list has alternate lines of dealing with a Stoutland because you have Basin attach, you have Raihan attach to Zard, and you obviously have Snorlax. And if ever you get a turn attachment onto any of these before the Stoutland comes down, you're really close to getting these even under, like, without using Raihan. You can chorus and find the pieces to still get a response. So I think this deck is like really underplayed for Lost Box. I think it's so good, to be honest, and I could still just be jamming the same 60 twice in a row. I don't think I've ever jammed the same exact list in 2 regionals in a row, but I think I could actually be doing it going forward. And then there's Kyogre Lost Box. This is the one that I've kind of put like the least amount of time into, I'll be completely honest with that. Because I'm not a huge believer in the Aquastorm combo. I think it's, again, too combo-y, and I think the more awareness people have of this list, the worse it kind of gets in my mind. I don't necessarily see it being super favored into like mirrors as well. You can think about flip-flopping Rod and Recycler just for more access to that Manaphy. I am at 3 captures to sort of give you a little bit of that going on against Raikou Rays. And I'm playing 1 Raihan as well as Birdkeeper as my additional supporters. The main reason around Raihan is to try and help you get Belt for your Snorlax to actually thump through a Stoutland as quickly as possible, because without that you're kind of shaking. So yeah, those are the kind of the main ideas around the Kyogre list. If you really want to add in the Drapion, again, you could, but I don't think it's mandatory anymore. So yeah, pretty happy with that. And again, if you want lightning attackers, you can just mix up your energy counts. Go down to like 3 Psychic, go down to like 4 Water, add in your lightning stuff. If you really want that, you can cut a Snorlax for a lightning tech if you feel like it's worthwhile. I don't really expect too much Dunsparce, even with that new Raikou on the block kind of list. Dunsparce just isn't that strong in Mirror. It gives people avenues to use Stoutland anyway, so I can foresee people continuing to not play Dunce, so playing a Lightning Tech could still be reasonable. Now, I think the Zekrom's probably not all that great, but you could end up playing like Zeraora or something like that as a 1-prize option that takes advantage of Belt. So those are the 3 Lost Boxes right now. I would probably be jamming Zard Lost Box, to be perfectly honest with you. But I am really intrigued by Rayquaza as well. I just think it's a really taxing deck to play on your brain. So it's like a full-on get your 9 hours, be very well tested with this deck. If you're watching this video and haven't started playing this deck, I wouldn't even consider it, to be honest with you. I think it's already too far gone for you to pick up and play, because this isn't a pick up and play deck, because when it comes to the 7th hour of you playing it, and it's game 3, and you're trying to remember whether or not your deck had 2 fighting or 2 grass, and you are confused whether it was game 1 or 3 that you did your deck search and remembered one was in the prizes and you got a blind select, that's when it hits you. that's when it dawns on you that you shouldn't have played this list. You know what I mean? Let's go on to... So we've done the big 3. I would say really Arctura and Reggie's are kind of the next decks to look at. Reggie's been doing really well online recently. That's part of the reason why I'm at double collapsed with my Lugia. But this is a very straightforward, simple Reggie's. I'm playing the Rope in here as like the only tech card, so you can try and sonar it back if there is going to be Ice Cube or Pikachu or whatever. If you just want to play 4th net, or if you want to play the 1 Air Balloon, you certainly could do that. Even cutting it for Lotto is pretty reasonable. The only things that I'm like not a huge fan of with the list is playing 3 Rod is punishing at times, so take that what you will, but yeah, it's more or less the shell that we've seen over and over again with Regis, and if you choose to respect your techs, you can. But Full Stadium seems very strong, and Path seems to be definitely the way. It can buy you time against Mew, it can buy you time against Lugia. Even shutting down Greninja draws from Lost Box is massive, so yeah, I think Path is just busted again right now. So capitalizing on that and being a disruptive deck with that, plus Marnie's inherently in the deck, is just very, very strong. Arctura doesn't really change too much. I mean, I've got a list, but it's not nothing too spectacular, to be honest with you. You know what you're doing if you're playing Arctura at this point. The only thing I'm not doing right now is playing Mustard, but it's something you can go for if you really want to. I don't really have much to say on Arctura. I mean, I've negged it so many times on the channel, and it doesn't really seem to bother anyone who plays it, so I'm sure they already have their own plans in mind. I guess the only other thing I want to talk about is Vika Palk. This deck is really intriguing me, and my testing is showing that it's actually still quite strong. I prefer the Palkia Vikavolt over the Aerodactyl Vikavolt Drapion Ditto deck, the Krekla deck that got second. I think the Aerodactyl is clearly much better against Lugia if you're not expecting them to play answers like Cologne or anything, because you could just get embarrassed by the Aerodactyl just like being teched for, right? Whereas this list is more sort of crossing your fingers that the Vikavolt does stuff, but you have this better backbone of like Palkia being a great racing card and just helping you use Radiant Greninja and all this other stuff. What I do think about this Vikavolt in general is that it's one of the best punishers for Lost Box, and the more I see this format, the more I want to play Lost Box myself. And I know that some of the strongest players in the US have been piloting Lost Box this entire format, just with small iterations here and there, and Zapdos Vikavolt is just a really powerful combo against them, and having Zigzagoon obviously to allow you to hit 70s onto the Confe, forcing something else up into the active, plus the Zapdos pushing you to the 60 to knock out Crams with weakness. It's just really good pressure, and it knocks out like all of their switch outs, and it knocks out the Mirage Gate, their main payoff card for non-Zardlax builds. So I really like Vikavolt in general. This list could possibly play Drapion if you really care that much about Mew, but you actually have a very decent racing option with the Raikou and the double Palkia. This deck still just looks on paper like quite bad, and it doesn't feel great to cross your fingers that Paralyzing Bolt works against Lugia, but the result speaks for itself. It's already won a regional. It's been a lot of Lugias to get there, and a similar build that was admittedly with Aerodactyl, which helps against the Lugia matchup. But in general, Item Lock can just do shenanigans against Lugia that I feel like it's a good enough threat to be a top contender. And honestly, I think it's something I'm certainly considering going forward. So this is very similar to the list that got first place. It's literally cut a Mew for a Zapdos. It's a consistency loss, but the power of Zapdos is just so strong, I think, against Lost Box that it allows you to cash in on them quickly and just get it over with, which I think is pretty important. So those are really the top decks. I'm not really a huge fan of Palkintel or Zoro. I don't think they're well placed in the meta. So let's have a look at the meta breakdown of these decks. Again, we'll start with Lugia. So as you can see, some of the worst matchups are Regis right now at 36%. This is in the last month of tournaments, over 50 players. 36% of the Regis is kind of why I'm starting to put in the Jammer and the Collapsed. I think both of these help the matchup substantially. Obviously, Jammer has to go alongside Manaphy to make sense. But I think that's going to give you a lot more help in the matchup. I think it certainly is reasonable. If you want to play Eldegoss over Second Fish, that could also help out just by having more Marnies at your disposal. But that's something you could really look for. Marnie's only good pre them finding gift energy, so it's not always that big of a deal. Outside of that, I'm pretty happy taking a bad Zoro because it's such a ballsy play to play Zoroark in the first place. And Mewtwo is that little bit awkward as well. We know we can try and do like fish jumping in with a double fish. We have the Bird Keeper that can help out that little bit. And my list was playing 16 energy, which is a small margin, but does help a little bit against the deck as well, so you have enough resources to see yourself through. So I know the percentages aren't great, but I think it's still a reasonable archetype in general. And then against the big stuff, reasonable into Mew. It's literally a coin flip, and Lost Zone Box, it says on paper that you're favoured against, but this is, hard to divvy up which lists are doing what. But I think definitely with the Jammers coming in, because obviously Stoutland Jammer blocks the big Snorlax play, right? It's such a big deal that Stoutland just lives, that it's so good against Lost Box. I think you become a farmer with my 60, so I think that's kind of helpful. And you're still reasonable into the Eternatus, which is meant to be this counter deck. You're basically a coin flip against it. And Arcdura is also reasonable out there as well. Let's have a look at Mew. Mew has some awkward stuff. It doesn't like the new Eternatus coming to light. It's still pretty awkward into Lost Zone Box. I imagine there would have been a lot more Drapion online tournaments over the last couple of weeks. Definitely the early part of December. So I think that's part of the negative win rate, but I still think it's awkward into Rayquaza, it's weak into all of the lists, because I imagine the Zard will still play Drapion. So you have to be a little bit worried there, but you are still making them have the good hands, especially with the Path Judge build. I think you have decent options there of becoming a nuisance for them and buying turns by Psychic Leaping. Weak into music control, like play the Parasol and the Silene and do your best, I guess is kind of my only advice I have for that. And weak into Regis as well. With Lost Cities, both the lists, you have win conditions there. Again, Judges can be handy in the opening stages. If you want to play Jammer, again, that can be a decent card in Mew for survival against a Gigas. So if you really want to tech for that, you can go for it, or add the Avery back into both lists. It could be a reasonable include. I think Reggie is like basically back on high alert for this weekend. I think that would be more or less my takeaway, is what I'm really thinking. I think a lot of people may sort of shrug and just say, well, Reggie's has a good matchup spread. Let's actually have a look at that now. On paper, it's good into the big three, right? It's 60% plus into the big three. But I think this, again, is like deceptive data. I think you're decent into Kyogre and Rayquaza as Reggie. Actually, the Rayquaza has Raikou plus Zigping. So I think you're mostly just like good into the Zard build. Whereas the others still have decent game plans into you. I think Lugia needs to be adapting. Like, I'm respecting it a lot with the 60 that I'm looking at today. But I think there's a lot of reason, like, you can see why Reggie's is kind of farming Lugia right now. And then Mew, again, you can sort of see why, because Mew is having to do so many other things right now in the format. So Reggie's is kind of being left unchecked. So my piece of advice would be to not leave Reggie unchecked this weekend. It's also really just a bad feeling losing to Reggie, because you know your opponent really hasn't done any decisions throughout the entire game. They've just put 6 guys down and start using their ability. Like, yeah. I'm not a big fan of the Reggie deck. I never have been. And it's kind of like the roulette deck of the format. I'd be respecting it, though, this weekend going forward. Lost Zone Box, you never really know what the data looks like based on which build you're playing, so it's a hard one to really look into too much. Having that awkward Reggies again, that's only really down to a couple of the lists. Having quite a weak Lugia, I think my biggest headache for Lost Box would be, firstly, there's a small uprising of Vikavolt, but second, there's going to be a number of Lugias that play Raikou and Stoutland, and I think that's quite bad for you, because then you have to commit a board space and ball search to a Manaphy in the opening stages. That guarantees that they can have some Stoutland options. Obviously, you're already going to have Comphase all over the place. But if you don't get that Manaphy developed, or if Stoutland deals with a Manaphy and you don't recycle it that turn, on the turn that you have to use Right Hand, or the turn that you have to use like Chorus Gate or whatever, you have to also somehow weave in a Manaphy recovery. Otherwise, the Raikou takes another 2-prize knockout, and that's just like a lot of pressure. You're this 1-prize deck, whereas the Lugia's somehow been able to get 2-prize turns against you. That's why I think the matchup is like so kind of ugly. So that's a bit of a worry. And Dura, again, it's matchup dependent. If you're playing the Rayquaza build, you don't really care. If it's Kyogre, it's maybe a little bit weaker. If it's Charizard, it's a little bit weaker as well. But I think Lost Box is still very reasonable. Eternatus as well. It's something that we don't have a huge amount of data on. It's kind of an interesting deck, though. Very strong into the Mew. Relatively strong into Lugia. Like, it's a 50-50 Lugia, and that's not great for a counter deck, but that's where we're at. And apparently a little bit weak into Lost Box, which surprises me, because Weezing's a card, but there you go. And it's kind of still bad on the fringes. Seems to be good into Reggie's, though. Just Weezing in general seems to be good into Reg. So kind of an interesting deck, kind of looking into the format. I know it got a couple day 2 placements in the previous regional, so maybe people have adapted that list and improved it going forward. So those are really my thoughts. I think really I would still be looking at the big 3/big 5 decks as best contenders going into this event. I think it's a really easy play to just play Lugia this tournament as well. I personally like respecting Reggie's whilst having the sort of catch-all Tool Jammer, which I think is just a really strong card that's not been utilised in the deck. Let me know your thoughts on Jammer in Lugia. Is this pure copium? Are you committing your tech slots to other things? Are you starting to respect the E-Turns of the world, the Aerodactyls of the world? I'll hear your thoughts down below. Is it time to re-sleeve up Drapion, or are they coming out of the list? Thanks so much for watching, guys. Good luck in San Diego. I'm going to be looking in great detail at the tournament. I'll be going over the top 8 lists and whatnot, because it's the final preparation before Liverpool. I will see you tomorrow for another video as well, so cheers.